We all know the legend of Julius Caesar, the conqueror, the dictator, the man who changed Rome forever. But behind this titan of history stood another figure, equal parts friend, fighter, and political force. This is the untold story of Mark Antony, the man who rose beside greatness, stood at the heart of empire, and fell in the arms of a queen. This is not just a story of war and politics. This is a story of friendship, betrayal, passion, and ambition. This is a fall of the mighty. Born of Rome, forged by chaos. Mark Antony's journey didn't begin on the sands of Egypt. It began in the bustling heart of Rome in 83 BC. Born into a noble but troubled family, he was the descendant of Hercules. But his father, Marcus Antonius Creticus, brought more scandal than glory. After his father died, his mother's new husband got involved in political conspiracies, casting a shadow over Antony's youth. As a teenager, Antony was more infamous than famous. Gambling, drinking, chasing women. He was the Roman version of a wild child. But even in his chaos, people saw a spark. He had charm, he had presence, and deep down, a hunger for power. Fire and blood, the making of a soldier. Before the war cries of Gaul, before the thunderous applause in Caesar's courts, Mark Antony was just another Roman youth with too much pride and not enough discipline. But sometimes the fire that burns wild just needs the right battlefield to forge it into something dangerous, something legendary. Rome knew him as a playboy, a man more comfortable at the dice table than the Senate floor. But inside, he carried the blood of warriors. His grandfather had commanded armies. His lineage traced back, so they said, to Hercules himself. But that blood meant nothing without honor. And Antony? He had none, until the East called him. A desert road leading into Syria, soldiers marching, camels groaning. Antony, now dressed in armor, squints into the sun, older, still reckless, but focused. He joined the staff of Aulus Gabinius, a Roman general sent to clean up chaos in Syria and Judea. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, but war has a way of reshaping men. And Antony, well, he thrived in it. Battles in dusty cities, Antony leading cavalry charges, clashing swords in alleyways, flames rising behind him as he lifts a Roman standard. In Judea, he fought alongside Herod's father to restore order. In Egypt, he helped reinstall Pharaoh Ptolemy XII, father of the woman who would one day change his fate forever, Cleopatra. But he wasn't just a brute with a blade. Soldiers followed him, not just because he was brave, but because he was magnetic. He laughed in the face of danger. He shared wine with the men. He bled beside them. This was where the legend began, not in marble halls, but in fire and blood. And word of this rising star, the wild soldier with a lion's heart, would soon reach the ears of the greatest general Rome had ever known. Iron and ambition, brothers in arms. Antony and Caesar. War became his classroom. He trained under Aulus Gabinius in Syria, and later joined Julius Caesar in Gaul. Here in the muddy fields of conquest, Antony's wild energy was molded into disciplined power. Caesar saw something in him, a loyal soldier, a natural leader, a friend who would charge into fire without flinching. And Antony? He saw in Caesar a master of strategy and a king of politics. Their bond wasn't just military, it was brotherhood. History remembers the Civil War, the betrayal, the daggers in the dark. But before all that, before the Senate turned against itself, there were two men in the wilds of Gaul, united not by birth, but by ambition and bloodshed. Mark Antony wasn't just another officer under Caesar. He was his sword arm, his shield, his storm. In Gaul, Antony wasn't tamed. He was unleashed. For 8 brutal years, they fought together. Caesar the mind, Antony the muscle. One conquered with words, the other with war cries. Against the Helvetii, the Belgae, and even the mighty Vercingetorix, Antony rode at the head of the charge. They shared more than victories. They shared risks, secrets, jokes whispered under siege towers, wounds stitched in silence. Wine poured over campfires late at night, far from the marble of Rome. Together they conquered more than Gaul. They conquered loyalty. When the world would later call Antony Caesar's shadow, they forgot shadows only fall behind fire. And Caesar? He had never burned brighter. But the Senate grew fearful. The old order stirred. The time of Gaul was ending. And somewhere on the road ahead, the Ides of March waited. But not yet, for now they were brothers. Flames of war, the Roman Civil War. As Caesar's power grew, so did fear in the Senate. They backed Pompey and civil war broke out. Mark Antony didn't hesitate. He stayed loyal to Caesar through every battle, every siege. He wasn't just a soldier now. He was a leader, holding political offices, commanding armies, and carving out his own space in Rome's bloody chessboard. It was just a stream, shallow, unassuming, but in the heart of winter, on the edge of destiny, it became the line between peace and war. Rome had ordered him to disband his army, to return as a private man. But Caesar was no ordinary man, and he was no longer alone. With the crossing of a stream, civil war was no longer rumor. It was reality. Caesar did not come as a supplicant, but as a conqueror. And Antony would be the fist behind the blade. Together they marched on the heart of the Republic, not to destroy it, but to reshape it. Not for glory alone, but for legacy and revenge and survival. The Rubicon was crossed, not just the river, but the point of no return. From this day forward, brother would rise against brother, and Rome would burn. Tension rising in Rome. Word spread like wildfire. Julius Caesar, with Mark Antony at his side, had crossed the Rubicon, a single act that shattered centuries of tradition. Rome, once the jewel of order and law, was now a powder keg. The Senate panicked. Pompey, the great general and once Caesar's ally, now branded him a traitor, and the city braced for war. Mark Antony rode ahead, commanding legions with a new fire in his heart. He had been Caesar's sword in Gaul. Now he was his shield in Italy. Senators scrambled. Some fled the city. Others stayed behind, hoping to cling to whatever scraps of power remained. But none could deny it. Rome was on the verge of collapse. Amid the chaos, the people watched. Many loved Caesar for what he had done for them: land, bread, security. Others feared what he might become, a king in all but name. And in the shadow of all this, Antony stood tall, loyal, fierce, watching the city he once called home prepare to tear itself apart. The Senate called for resistance. Pompey mustered his legions, but Caesar and Antony were already moving. The die was cast. There would be no turning back. March of the Legions, the thunder of iron feet. They marched, not as rebels, but as loyal soldiers following a man who claimed no crown, yet wielded absolute command. Through dust-choked roads and frostbitten fields, Caesar's legions pushed south. Mark Antony rode beside him, leading the vanguard, his eyes locked on the horizon. Their mission was simple: take Rome, without burning it. No banners flew above them. No fanfare welcomed their approach. Only silence and fear. The people of Italy watched the steel tide roll in, uncertain whether to cheer or flee. Pompey, caught off guard, gathered what forces he could. But the legions of Caesar were different, hardened by years of conquest in Gaul. They moved with the discipline of wolves and the hunger of lions. Antony's voice was the fire in their march. He drilled the men by moonlight, scouted terrain by day. Every village they passed, every bridge they crossed, it was all cataloged, memorized. They were not just marching, they were preparing for the inevitable siege of destiny. And yet, Caesar ordered no pillaging, no looting. This was still their homeland. They were conquerors, yes, but of principle, not plunder. As the legions neared Rome, Pompey and the Senate fled across the Adriatic. The eternal city, mother of empires, was left undefended. The gates opened, not in defiance, but in surrender. Mark Antony was the first through. No sword drawn, no blood spilled, just the weight of history pressing down on every stone beneath their boots. Rome belonged to Caesar now, but the war had only just begun. Caesar's dictatorship begins. The lion in the forum. He entered the Curia not as a king, not yet, but as a victor the Republic could no longer contain. Rome had changed. Its heartbeat now matched the measured stride of Caesar's legions. Its streets echoed not with senatorial debate, but with the silence of awe and fear. Mark Antony, newly appointed as Caesar's master of the horse, his chief lieutenant, stood by his side, vigilant. Together, they began the work of transformation. Caesar accepted the title dictator, but with careful restraint. 6 months, they promised. A temporary measure, they swore. But the ink was still wet on the decree when changes began to sweep through the Republic. Debts were forgiven, bread was distributed, grain laws reformed, veterans received land. The people cheered, the Senate whispered. Antony became the hammer of Caesar's will, organizing the city, pacifying the remaining provinces, eliminating resistance with words when possible, with swords when not. But peace in Rome was only an illusion. Pompey had not been defeated, only displaced. He gathered allies in the east. Forces swelled. Kings pledged loyalty. Caesar would not wait, nor could he. The Republic's fragile mask had cracked, and its enemies were sharpening their knives. So once more the legions would march. And at Caesar's right hand, Mark Antony. Betrayal in the Senate. The death of Caesar. There are no victories without enemies, and no crowns without blood. Pharsalus had shattered Pompey's dreams. Egypt had taken his life. The Senate had bowed, the legions had followed, and Rome, for the first time in its long bloodied history, had a single man at its helm. Julius Caesar was no longer just dictator. He was dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, a title whispered with awe among the people, and with venom among the elite. Mark Antony stood beside him still, loyal as ever. But Antony saw the whispers, the glances, the sudden silence when he entered a room. There was unease, tension hidden beneath togas and smiles. They met in shadowed atriums and candlelit chambers. Brutus, Cassius, Decimus, and over 60 more. Senators who feared not only Caesar's power, but what it meant for their own. And so they sharpened their blades, not for Rome, not for freedom, but for fear. The Ides of March, 44 BC. Caesar walked the marble corridors of the theater of Pompey, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that fate had drawn its sword. Antony, delayed outside, perhaps lured away by design, arrived too late. Inside, Caesar stood encircled. The men he had forgiven, embraced, promoted, turned upon him like wolves. First one blade, then another, and another. Flesh split, blood spilled, and as Caesar stumbled beneath the bronze statue of Pompey, his old rival, it was not just a man who fell, but a republic, a world, a dream. Et tu, Brute, the last breath of a man who had conquered the world, but not the hearts of its guardians. The tyrant was dead, but peace did not follow, because in the shadows of the Curia, another figure stirred, loyal, furious, Mark Antony. Antony's funeral speech. The Senate had spoken. Caesar, the dictator, was dead. His body, once a vessel of strength and ambition, now lay cold upon the altar of power, surrounded by those who would rise on his death. Yet among the wreckage, in the shadow of his assassins, stood Mark Antony, the friend, the loyalist, the avenger. His grief was deep, but his resolve was unshaken. For if Caesar was gone, Rome would need someone to speak for him. On the day of Caesar's funeral, a great crowd gathered in the forum. The air was thick with uncertainty, whispers of revenge, and the scent of betrayal. But as Antony stood before the multitude, He would not merely mourn a man. He would ignite a fire that would consume the Republic. With Caesar's blood on his hands, Antony raised his voice. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously hath Caesar answered it. Hear under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man. So are they all honorable men. Come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. Bear witness, Romans, and let them remember. The death of Caesar was no noble sacrifice for the Republic." The crowd fell silent, the tension palpable. Every word, each syllable, carried the weight of destiny. He spoke not just to the people, but to the assassins, to those who had betrayed Caesar, to the men who thought they had killed an empire. Antony's voice boomed with righteous indignation. A master of rhetoric, he spun the words into a tapestry of emotion. He would not just recount Caesar's deeds. He would weave a narrative that would leave Rome no choice but to avenge its fallen hero. Antony paused, letting the words sink deep. His tone turned softer, measured, almost contemplative. With every word, he reinforced Caesar's image as a benevolent leader, a man of the people, betrayed by those who claimed to act in the name of the Republic. And in doing so, Antony began to tear at the very fabric of Roman politics. His speech, crafted with the skill of a seasoned orator, turned the tide of public opinion. Where there was doubt, there was now outrage. Where there was sadness, there was anger. And where once the Senate held power, now the people turned their eyes toward the streets, toward vengeance. Antony's voice cracked with feigned sorrow, adding weight to his words. The crowd, once mourning, now simmered with resentment. And as his speech came to a close, Antony laid the blood-stained toga upon the ground, the symbol of Caesar's sacrifice now held high for all to see. The senators, those who thought they had silenced Caesar's power, now faced the wrath of the very people they had sworn to serve. Antony, in his grief, had turned the people into a vengeful mob. The people raged. They had been manipulated, and yet they were ready to fight. And so the cycle of violence began. Caesar had died, but his spirit, his ideals, and his revenge lived on through the words of his closest ally. Antony's speech was the spark that ignited the flames of civil war. The Senate had struck a blow against Caesar, but in doing so, they had made Antony the heir to his legacy. Rome was on the brink of chaos. The Republic, once built on the ideals of balance and power, was slipping into the hands of those who would manipulate it for their own gain. The formation of the Second Triumvirate, brothers in vengeance. The forum still echoed with the cries of Caesar's death. The Senate bled authority, and the people raged like a storm denied its release. Rome was not just grieving, it was unraveling. In the ashes of that chaos, 3 men emerged, each with fire in his heart and blood on his hands. Mark Antony, Caesar's right hand, Octavian, his young adopted heir, and Lepidus, a commander with power but no illusions of destiny. They did not meet as friends. They met as survivors, each knowing the path forward required unity or war. And so, history bore witness to a fragile alliance sealed not by loyalty, but necessity. Antony's voice cracked and filled with rage, saying, "We bring justice to Caesar's death, or Rome will fall to ruin." And Octavian, cold, measured, replied, "Then let us avenge him, not as servants of the Senate, but as rulers of Rome." The Second Triumvirate was born, not in the Senate, but in a pact of blood. A legal dictatorship of 3, wielding power, not seen since Sulla. Their first act, the proscriptions. Enemies of the state, names etched into wood, then carved into flesh. Senators, nobles, even friends. None were spared. For power demands sacrifice, and the Triumvirate would bathe Rome in fear to forge a new order. What had begun as revenge became empire. And though united, cracks already stirred beneath their feet. Octavian sought legacy. Antony hungered for power. Lepidus, caught between giants, clung to relevance. The Second Triumvirate was no alliance of honor. It was a knife edge, 3 blades pointed outward and inward. But for now, Rome marched under one standard, one voice, and the name of Caesar still echoed in every oath. The Republic was gone. The age of the Triumvirs had begun, and though Caesar was dead, the war for his legacy had only just begun. The Battle of Philippi, the echo of blades. In the plains of Philippi, vengeance found its altar. 2 armies stood across the marsh, Rome divided against herself. On one side, the liberators of Caesar's killers. On the other, his avengers. Brutus and Cassius, the last champions of the Republic, fortified the hills. Antony and Octavian, bearing Caesar's legacy, made ready to strike. Antony, to his officers, shouting, "No mercy, no retreat, for Caesar, for Rome." The first charge. Antony's forces stormed the marshes, cutting through mud and javelins. Cassius counters fiercely, his men dug in like stone. The first clash was chaos. Shields shattered, chariots overturned, blood soaking the wheat fields. Cassius was driven back, but not broken. Cassius, bitterly to himself. They say Antony's dead, yet the ground shakes with his fury. Misled by false reports, Cassius, overcome by despair, draws his blade and takes his own life. His death, a tragic error. Brutus, unaware, fought on. A week passes. Brutus leads a second, desperate charge. He pierces Octavian's lines, but Antony encircles him from the rear. Brutus, the last hope of the Republic, stood surrounded, and like Cassius before him, he chose death over surrender. Brutus falls on his sword. The field falls silent. Ravens circle overhead. The Republic died that day, not with a vote, but with a sword. And the Triumvirs, blood-stained and unchallenged, claimed her ashes. But peace would not last. Antony and Octavian were like fire and oil, and Rome wasn't big enough for both. Rivals in peace, the fracture within. With Brutus gone and Caesar's assassins punished, Rome exhaled. But peace is a shallow sea. Beneath its surface, tides of ambition began to churn. Mark Antony, now master of the East, found solace and sovereignty in Alexandria. At his side, the Queen of Egypt, mother of his children, ruler of his heart. Meanwhile, Octavian, in Rome, stoic, calculating, watching the Senate. Octavian stayed in the West, young in years but old in strategy. He played the Senate like a liar, plucking fear and favor with equal skill. A courier arrives in Rome with news of Antony's will, naming his children by the Queen of Egypt as heirs. Octavian, to Agrippa, saying, "Antony would divide Rome like a dowry. No Roman blood will kneel to Egypt's throne." The bond forged at Philippi had cracked. In its place grew suspicion, jealousy, destiny. Once allies by necessity, now rivals by fate, Antony and Octavian would soon meet on the last battlefield of the Republic's broken dreams. The alliance of great nations, Antony and Cleopatra. While Octavian tightened his grip on Rome, Antony turned east. There in Egypt, he met Cleopatra, the queen, the goddess, the symbol of ancient power. What began as strategy became passion. Their love shocked Rome. But to Antony and Cleopatra, it was a union of hearts and empires. Together they dreamed of a new dynasty. They had 3 children, blending the blood of Rome and Egypt. From the embers of war rose a new power. Not Roman, not Egyptian, but something greater. A union not forged in Senate halls or temples of marble, but in passion, ambition, and the promise of empire. Mark Antony and Cleopatra, names that would echo through eternity. Antony stands on Cleopatra's barge, silk sails billowing. Musicians play softly. The queen appears, cloaked in white, gold asp around her arm. Cleopatra, smiling, You were born to conquer, Mark Antony, but here you do not need a sword. He came to Egypt seeking allies. He found a queen with the heart of a lioness and the wisdom of Isis. Together they dreamed of a world not divided but ruled, East and West united by love and dominion. Cleopatra offered her fleets, her treasure, her people. Antony gave Rome's legions and his name. They formed an alliance not only of nations, but of destinies. Children were born of their union. Caesarion proclaimed the rightful heir of Julius Caesar, a threat Octavian could not ignore. To the Senate, Antony had become a traitor, seduced by a foreign queen, corrupted by gold and incense. To Octavian, he was something worse, a rival with a legacy as powerful as his own. Two hearts, two empires, bound by love and vengeance. Against the rising tide of Rome, they would stand or fall together. The Battle of Actium. It began on the waters of Actium, where the winds carried the fate of two worlds. On one side, the might of Rome under Octavian. On the other, the defiant alliance of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. The sea itself would decide the future of empires. The trap had been set well. Agrippa's tactics were flawless. The sea narrowed, the winds turned. Antony's larger ships, mighty but slow, became islands under siege. And then, the unthinkable. Cleopatra's fleet turned, slipping past the chaos, heading for Egypt. Whether betrayal or strategy, none can say. But Antony followed. The tide of war turned with him. Octavian emerged victorious, not with thunder but with patience. Rome belonged to him now. The Battle of Actium did not end with swords, it ended with silence, and the slow unraveling of an empire built on passion, pride, and dreams. With the fleet shattered and the East lost, Antony returned to Egypt, a broken man. In the halls of Alexandria, once alive with laughter and music, only shadows remained. News came like a dagger, false whispers that Cleopatra had taken her own life. Grief-stricken, Antony fell on his sword, choosing death over defeat. But she lived still, and when they brought her to him, dying but not yet gone, their eyes met one last time. No words, only the echo of a love that defied empires. Cleopatra, Queen of Kings, would not be paraded through the streets of Rome. She chose the serpent's kiss, a quiet defiance against the march of fate. So passed the last pharaoh and her Roman lover, in death as in life, united. And thus ended the tale of Mark Antony, general, statesman, lover, and legend, not with the roar of triumph, but with the whisper of memory. History remembers Caesar, it remembers Cleopatra, but Mark Antony, the loyal general, the fierce fighter, the passionate lover, is often a footnote. But now his story is told, not as a shadow of Caesar, not just as Cleopatra's consort, but as a man who dared to challenge Rome and loved too fiercely to survive it. If these silent whispers of the past speak to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss a journey through time. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and be a part of the conversation. This is Silent Whispers of the Past, where history lives, breathes, and speaks once more. Until next time, keep your ears to the echoes and your heart open to the stories time forgot.